I love One Piece. I play my fair share of trading card games, so, of course I know about the new One Piece cards. I even have some. And I must say, it has been just so fascinating to me watching this card game financially succeed, even in the West, as much as it has been. Because I've been a One Piece fan for a pretty long time now. One Piece still had ending theme songs when I was first getting into it. That's how long it's been. And a lot of people, or, at least a lot of people in the West, forget that once upon a time, there was another One Piece card game that came out stateside, and it was very, very, very short-lived, and I can only assume that it's because it didn't do well here at all. Even now, hardly anyone seems to remember that this was a thing that happened, but against all odds, I assure you that it did. Let me tell you all about it. So, the year is 2005, and the place is North America. Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh!, and by extension their card games, were really big in the late 90s and early 2000s, and as a result of that, there's this massive wave of anime card games being brought to the West, hoping to capitalize on that success. But spoiler alert, none of these would go on to reach the same stratospheric highs that Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! Did. To help demonstrate just how many anime card games there were, here's just a few of the IPs that either got card games that were originally made in the West, or whose card games got officially brought over to the West during either the 90s or 2000s. Dot Hack, Sailor Moon, Digimon, Full Metal Alchemist, Card Captors, Naruto, and of course, One Piece. I couldn't find the announcement for it in Bandai's press archive, but in June 2005, ANN reported that, quote, Bandai America will release a 115-card One Piece trading card game in September. The game will be available in 64-card starter sets for $9.99 and 10-card booster packs for $3.99. And in case you were wondering just how people felt about this at the time, the people in the comments section didn't exactly seem thrilled about the, totally fresh idea of, yet another anime card game, so, there's that. But anyways, I remember hearing about the card game by way of One Piece Grand Adventure, which was a Power Stone-esque One Piece fighting game that came out in North America in August of 2006. And as a North American release, it's honestly a really interesting game for a couple of reasons. First of all, because this game never actually came out in Japan. It was only released in North America, Australia, and Europe. But there's a bit of an asterisk here. So, Grand Adventure is essentially just a bigger version of One Piece Grand Battle. And there's two different answers to what One Piece Grand Battle is. Originally, One Piece Grand Battle was a fighting game on the PS1 that came out in Japan in 2001 and Europe in 2003. In Japan, there would go on to be 3 main Grand Battle games, as well as Grand Battle Rush, which came out in 2005. Much later in 2014, there would be One Piece Super Grand Battle X as well. But, going back to 2005, another game called One Piece Grand Battle would be released in North America and Europe. And despite often being referred to as an English version of Grand Battle Rush, it's way more bare bones than Grand Battle Rush. The most obvious example of this is the roster. And I can only assume that this is because at the time of the North American Grand Battle's release, One Piece was still relatively new as far as its officially licensed English language version, aka the 4Kids dub, went. And, I have an entirely separate video about this if you're interested in learning more about it, but suffice to say, at the time the English language rights to One Piece were owned by 4Kids, whose absolute train wreck of a dub didn't start airing until September 2004. So by the time Grand Battle came out in North America, One Piece had only been airing in North America for almost, but not quite a year. One Piece Grand Adventure, which came out almost a year after Grand Battle in North America, had a bigger roster and more features. So in that sense, it was a lot closer to Grand Battle Rush than the Grand Battle that came out in North America. But even so, it still wasn't quite the same game. Again, the most obvious example of this is in the roster. For example, Wobble and Ohm aren't playable in Grand Battle Rush, but they are in Grand Battles 2 and 3 respectively. And Adventure did have Zeph and Kuina, who weren't playable in any of the other Grand Battle games, and honestly, I would be really curious to learn more about how Grand Adventure was, effectively able to get 2 exclusive characters if the opportunity arose, but I'm starting to veer off topic. The other thing that makes this game so interesting is that it contained characters, stages, costumes, and so on from the Skypia arc. And that's really fascinating for the time because ultimately 4Kids only got so far as the block of filler between Alabasta and Skypia. Or, to word that more simply, 4Kids never actually got to the Skypia arc. So this game offers an interesting glance into some of the things that could have been if 4Kids had made it that far. In particular, voices, the decision to call the villain of the arc Ineru rather than Enel, stuff like that. But anyways, like I was saying earlier, I heard about this One Piece card game through Grand Adventure, which let you collect the cards in-game. But as for how many other people heard about the game that way, or other ways that they probably could have heard about it, it's honestly really hard to say. Like, that ANN article that I mentioned earlier about its release was the only article that I could find about it on ANN. And I did some skimming around through my anime magazine collection as well. Or, to be more specific, I looked through issues of New Type USA, Protoculture Addicts, Animerica, Anime Insider, and Beckett Anime Collector that were dated between June and October of 2005. So, the idea was that the One Piece card game was announced in June and released in September, so presumably these would have been the prime months for getting the word out, writing about it, advertising for it, or, just whatever else. And the only magazines in this group that had anything relating to the One Piece card game were the September 2005 issue of Anime Insider and the October 2005 issue of Beckett Anime Collector. Anime Insider had a full-page ad and a mention of it in a small section about TCGs that they had, while Beckett had a small section for it in a section about anime news. Interestingly, by the way, the image that they used for it is not at all what the packs for the first set looked like, and the image of Luffy, at least, is what would be later used in the second set, although Crocodile would, at some point, get replaced with Ace. The obvious guess is that this was probably either a placeholder image or an early/rejected version of what packs were gonna look like that mistakenly, but nonetheless, somehow made it into the magazine anyways. But as much as I wish I could, I wasn't able to find answers to questions like what specifically happened here, was this anyone's fault, how many readers noticed this at the time, and the one that I'm most curious about, did Bandai and/or 4Kids notice? And yet, despite what this limited print marketing might make you think, a trip to the archives of the game's website shows that view counts on the news archive, well, relative to Bandai's other card games at the time, they're not the best, but they're still pretty decent. And while not every thread was necessarily about the card game, the forums seemed to be seeing some use as well. That being said, ultimately the site went down sometime between November of 2006 and February 2007. To be more specific, I think it happened sometime between November and December of 2006, because in November we see One Piece on the Bandai Card Games website, but on December 5th, it's gone. And I can only assume it was because this is around the time that 4Kids stopped dubbing One Piece. So basically what I'm getting at here is that outside of the cards being in Grand Adventure, what survives of the marketing seems pretty minimal. Not non-existent, but certainly not great. And yet, there were definitely some people, presumably pre-existing One Piece fans, taking an interest in this game. But despite this, honestly, I still don't blame Bandai, 4Kids, or whoever else was in charge of marketing this game for not marketing it all that much. Because even if this game was performing alright by the standards of other Bandai card games, which, to be clear, is an assumption that I'm making purely based on the level of activity on its site. To be clear, I was not able to find any hard sales data on how this game sold at all. That still doesn't necessarily mean that it was doing alright in a more general sense. Like, if it was doing alright enough that it was at least sustainable, let alone profitable. And since the anime card game market was already pretty oversaturated at the time, well, it certainly doesn't inspire optimism about this game's sales. This is to say nothing of the fact that while there demonstrably were a number of dedicated One Piece fans at the time, including myself, the fact of the matter is that back in the 2000s, One Piece was nowhere near as popular in the West as it is, say, today. And that is in no short part thanks to 4Kids, because, it's like I said earlier, this is an era where in the West, anime just isn't super affordable and accessible. So having a good dub airing on TV was often the biggest catalyst for an anime getting really popular in the Western anime fan community. And 4Kids One Piece just, oh my god, God, what do you want me to say about it that hasn't already been said a dozen times? It was just a mess, you know? I mean, who wanted to watch One Piece's incoherent and heavily edited and censored train wreck of a dub in general, let alone when shows like Naruto and Inuyasha were also around and scratched the same battle shonen itch, but without all the censorship, right? But getting back to the card game itself, ultimately, as far as the West is concerned, it had just 2 sets, the Quest Begins and Passage to the Grand Line. For perspective, in Japan, this card game started in 2002 and had 18 different sets, the last of which came out in 2005, which, for further perspective on where the One Piece anime was at the time, was about the brand new Water 7 arc. But getting back to the English language version, none of the cards had anything from past the Alabasta arc, although interestingly, there are cards from arcs that 4Kids cut and movies that 4Kids never released. To be more specific, 4Kids cut the Little Garden arc and Laboon. He was turned into an iceberg, and yes, it was just as weird as it sounds.
We're gonna crash!
So much for that iceberg!
But anyways, despite that, there are cards for Crocus, Laboon, Dory, and Brogy, as well as a few cards featuring stills from the Little Garden arc. Furthermore, 4Kids never dubbed any of the One Piece movies, of which there were 7 at the time of the announcement that they were no longer dubbing One Piece, and there's a few cards with characters in costumes from the 3rd movie. And just in case you were wondering, by the way, this is not the only time that something like this happened. Similarly, the last of the 3 One Piece games to come out in North America while 4Kids still had the rights to One Piece, Pirates Carnival, also had appearances by Laboon, Dory, and Brogy. And Grand Adventure has a stage where you can see Brogy in the background as well. It's actually kind of a funny story. So, the stage itself is from the Davy Backfight arc, which, you know, 4Kids certainly never got to. And in Grand Battle Rush, Brogy just is not there. It's Big Pond. But I guess, for whatever reason, I'm honestly not entirely sure who would have made this decision, but evidently someone made the decision to replace a character that wasn't yet in the official English language version of One Piece with a character whose episodes simply were not in the official English language version of One Piece. Put a little more simply, they replaced a character who wasn't in the 4Kids dub with another character who wasn't in the 4Kids dub, which, okay, I guess. But getting back to the card game, another thing that I want to mention is how they addressed 4Kids' many visual censors. So, in case you don't know, 4Kids would become infamous for the many visual censors that they ended up putting in One Piece. Perhaps the most well-known of these was that they turned Sanji's cigarettes into lollipops, but my personal favorite will always be this. So, do these visual censors make it into the card game? Well, they are so very careful to not show any cleavage, just as 4Kids was. And Sanji, oh my god, this is so funny. They have completely removed the cigarette/lollipop in its entirety. I mean, god, you know, he kinda has something in his mouth on this card, but even then, it's just one card, and it's kinda hard to tell. Incidentally, this is also what 4Kids did to Smoker, who they renamed to Chaser, in the show as well. His mouth was just always weirdly, slightly ajar, and, you know, naturally, his card is like this as well. That being said, while I wasn't able to find details that would explain how/why this happened, let alone if 4Kids and or Bandai noticed this at any point, there is at least one 4Kids visual censor that these cards missed. So, in the 4Kids dub, they made Mihawk's sword and necklace knife thing look less cross-like, but there's a card where he's holding up his sword, and lo and behold, it's the regular cross-like version. Now, if they were gonna miss one of 4Kids' visual censors, I mean, honestly, this definitely seems like one of the likelier candidates, since it just doesn't seem like an obvious censor for 4Kids to make. And Mihawk had, maybe 5 minutes of total screen time at this point? But all the same, god, you know, I'm a simple person. I can't help but chuckle. You know, it makes me chuckle for the same reason that the card that should say Caltrops says Carltrops makes me chuckle. You know, I really just don't know what else to tell you. So now that we have all this background information about the game, let's go ahead and get to talking about the game itself. So, among the people who bought, at least a few packs of the One Piece cards at the time was a much younger Kennedy, who at the time never bothered to learn how to play the game, but, they just really liked that it was some kind of officially licensed One Piece merchandise, because at the time, there wasn't exactly an abundance of that in the States, and what little we did have was not fantastic, but alas, try as I might, I could not find any of those old cards, and I can only assume that they've been lost to the sands of time in any number of ways. So instead, for the sake of this video, for the sake of you, my beloved audience, I bought a starter deck off of eBay for like $30, and the starter deck is actually 2 starter decks and instructions for how to play the game, and I also found another seller with a bunch of unopened packs from Passage to the Grand Line, so I bought a few of those as well. Then I gathered some TCG-liking friends, and we tried learning how to play this game to find out if it was secretly really good this whole time, or if there's perhaps a reason why you don't really see a lot of people looking back on this game. Incidentally, I was also really curious about how similar or dissimilar this was from the current One Piece card game. And I'll go ahead and start this out by answering that last question first. Inevitably, they do have some superficial similarities, but overall, I wouldn't call them similar games. In fact, honestly, the card game that I was reminded of the most while I was learning how to play the 2000s One Piece card game was probably Card Fight Vanguard, but even so, I wouldn't go so far as to say something like, that it's super similar to Vanguard, and that if you know how to play Vanguard, then you know how to play this one too, Because they do have some similarities, yes, but I still wouldn't call them similar in general, if that makes any sense. Footnote. For the sake of clarity, I played Card Fight Vanguard in like 2014, 2015, somewhere around there, and I fell off of it around 2016 and 17 because I only knew one other person who played it. So when I say that this One Piece card game kind of reminds me somewhat of Vanguard, please know that I mean Vanguard circa the mid-2010s, alright? I have zero idea what is going on in Vanguard nowadays. But getting back on track, so the starter deck came with 2 32-card decks, some action counters, and a rule sheet. I was really shocked to find out just how small the decks are, and even more shocked to find out that 32 cards was actually the maximum size. But, in the moment, at least, I wasn't thinking too much of it. But I can tell you when I did start to think something of it, and it was when we actually started playing the game. Take this with a grain of salt because I haven't exactly played a ton of TCGs, but this game has a mulligan rule that I personally have not once encountered anywhere else. When you mull your hand, your previous hand, the entirety of your previous hand goes to the grave, which hilariously is called the ocean in this game. Now, right off the bat, this, it already doesn't sound like a great rule, right? Like, what if you don't open with any characters, but you got some really good technique cards? However statistically unlikely, it's bound to happen at some point or another. But it gets even worse when you remember that this card game only gives you a deck size of 32 cards, and at this point, you've already put 6 in the log, and I'll explain what that means in just a moment when I talk about how to play the game. But for now, that means that minus the 7 you're sacrificing by mulling, you're left now with a 19-card deck, 12 cards after you've pulled your hand. You do lose if you deck out in this game, and at the end of each turn, you're forced to draw until you've reached 4 cards. You also draw at the start of the turn if you have 4 cards or less in your hand. So what I'm getting at here is that you put yourself at a very real risk of dying to deck out in this game, just in general, but especially if you decide to mull. And honestly, both this rule about mulling and needing to have 4 cards at the end of each turn are just, God, they're just such perplexing design decisions to me because they just feel super unnecessary, but I digress. I feel like I am doing well, but because I have to keep drawing cards at the end of my turn to have 4 cards in my hand, I'm at 3 cards left. At this rate, even if I am playing well, I will lose to deck out. So how is the game played then? Well, I'm not gonna sit here and go over every single rule, but essentially, the game starts out, you and your opponent put 6 cards in the log, and then you draw a 7-card hand. You take up to 3 character cards, the maximum amount you can have on the field at any given time, and you assign one of them captain and the others comrades. The little log poses in the corner here, between the 3 characters you start with on the board, they can only have a collective total of 6 or less, because you bring characters out to the board with cards from the log corresponding with the number of log poses that they have here. And from there, you can take 3 actions per turn. Additional draws, putting cards in the log, which you can use to summon other comrades, putting comrades on the field, and of course, attacking. Your captain can attack anyone, meanwhile your comrades can only attack whichever of your opponent's comrades are in front of them, and if your opponent doesn't have 2 comrades on the field, then the captain as well. And presumably, since both players can start the game with characters on the field, there's no summoning sickness or any equivalent to it in this game, so you can just attack as soon as your first turn if you want to. To win in one of these battles, you have to either equal or greater their power, and power can be upped when you attack with various technique cards and reinforcements which you can bring in from your hand. But ultimately, the damage you deal is based on the damage counter. The damage counter indicates just how many logs effectively you remove from the opposing character, and they're gone once they're out of logs. Each time one of these logs is removed, you take one of the cards you set down to bring the card out. The game ends when someone's decked out, when someone's captain has been taken out, or when you've taken out 6 log poses worth of your opponent's comrades. Yeah, admittedly, this all sounds a lot more confusing than it actually is, and I found myself getting the hang of it after just one game. But anyways, as far as the starter decks go, the Luffy deck is by far the better deck. Granted, I only ended up playing 4 games, but each time the Luffy deck won. And I think that's because the Luffy deck, 1, just has better cards, and 2, because the Luffy deck just has more generic tools. It has more buffs that can benefit anyone than, say, the Alvita deck, which has a lot of buffs meant for specific characters. So it makes the Luffy deck just a lot easier to use. So yeah, overall, was the game secretly good this whole time? I would not say so. If I had to use one word to sum up how I felt about it, God, it was dull. It was just really, really dull. A lack of marketing, and that it was a One Piece card game in the West at a time where One Piece wasn't super popular in the West aside, it doesn't take all that much to see why this game never caught on. Granted, hey, maybe it's just because I only played with starter decks, and starter decks can be kinda hit or miss, but since this game is, God, as dead as it can possibly be, I guess I'll never find out. In any case, like I mentioned earlier, I also found some unopened packs of Passage to the Grand Line on eBay, and originally my plan was to use these packs to add some variety, even if only a little, to the starter decks. But after having actually played it, and certainly after learning that the decks have to be 32 cards, I quickly gave up on that idea. Nonetheless, I still had these packs, and who does not like a good pack opening video? So here is what my friends and I got. None of the super rare cards of the set, but it was fun all the same. I think the funniest thing that any of us got was that one of my friends got Ace, who was renamed Trace in the 4Kids dub. And why he's been renamed Trace, I, honest to God, have no idea. The closest thing I've seen to a substantial theory is that, maybe they thought it was a reference to gambling, but even that feels like kind of a stretch, since Ace is still a name, so I really just don't know. Side note, if anyone who worked on the 4Kids One Piece dub is watching this, if you would be up for it, I would love so very much to pick your brain and learn about why 4Kids made some of the weirder changes that it did, like this one. For real, please email me and let's talk. But once again, I am starting to veer off topic, so anyways, yeah, one of my friends got Trace, and they didn't know that Ace was renamed Trace in the 4Kids dub, so I got the very fun job of explaining that nonsensical decision, and honestly, that was pretty fun. Incidentally, I also had to explain that a number of the cards we got were from movies or arcs that 4Kids cut entirely, but I already explained that in this video. So, perhaps the nicest thing I can say about these cards is that the quality of the cardboard is shockingly good, so, that's cool, at least. But the game itself is just really, really lackluster, and especially next to the modern One Piece cards, these just look so incredibly plain. There's no variation in the graphic design, no art from outside of the anime, nothing done to really amp up the art. Visually, they're just nothing special, just nothing worth writing home about. And at least in my opinion, the visuals are by far the coolest thing about the modern One Piece cards. Like, here, let me just grab you... God, I don't know. Here's just a random example that I just kind of pulled from one of my friend's collections. Like, check this out. You could never have something that looked like this in the older game. Just visually, this is operating on a whole other level. So, in summary, I mean, I don't want to overstate it and make it sound like this is a train wreck, but, you know, at least in my opinion, it's just not very well designed. Like, it's not actively unfun once you get the hang of it, or anything else like that. It's certainly not so bad that it's good, it's just meh. And since the cards themselves look so plain, I mean, I liked having some of these in the 2000s because I liked having some of what very little officially licensed One Piece merchandise there was in the West, but if these came out nowadays, I wouldn't even bother. They just look so plain. I don't know. I just don't think I'd get any enjoyment just, like, flipping through them in a binder, you know? So yeah, in a nutshell, that's the lesser-known, widely forgotten One Piece card game of the 2000s. If you want to collect these, I wish you luck on your journey. You know, if nothing else, I'm sure they're gonna make for a really fun conversation piece, as evidenced by the fact that I did a whole video on the topic, but as for me, I think I've bought all the 2000s One Piece cards that I'm gonna buy, and I don't see myself revisiting the game itself if I don't have to. So on that note, so when is Grand Adventure coming to EVO?